I am the son of Hoser and Rachel Weizmann, as President of the state, pledge allegiance to the state of Israel and to its laws.
The first President of Israel is sworn in. A man of 75, broken in health, yet alive with an undimmed vision of man's hope. The date, February 2nd, 1949. Motl, a little village in Russia, one of hundreds of towns and villages of Eastern Europe, where Jews lived in isolation and in poverty. Here in the year of 1874, Chaim Weizmann, son of Rachel, son of Ozer, was born. Ozer Weizmann was a transporteur, a cutter and hauler of timber, which was floated downriver to the Baltic Sea. The Russia Weizmann knew was a forlorn corner of the Russian pale of settlement, a Russia darkened by intolerance and prejudice, by fear and anti-Semitism. Yet a child like Chaim Weizmann, with the fresh eyes of childhood, could see light within the darkness of persecution. In Motl, Jews lived a way of life now gone, still treasured in memory, but gone. A life brightened by the flame of an unbroken tradition, brightened by study of the Hebrew Bible, brightened by fervent prayer. In study and prayer, a child might learn the meaning of the word freedom and begin to harbor hope, the hope that somehow, some way, one could escape to a better life. Chaim Weizmann took his first step toward that better life in a Russian high school in Pinsk, and though he wore the typical uniform of a Russian schoolboy, beneath that uniform his heart yearned for a homeland which was not Russia. Pinsk was one of the cradles of modern Zionism, a movement which dreamed of the return of the Jewish people to Zion, the ancient homeland in Palestine. There were only 3 possible roads of escape from Russian ghetto life. The first led to the land of liberty, America. They stampeded by the thousands and the tens of thousands to the great cities of America, and particularly to New York. They worked and they struggled in the Lower East Side of New York, crowded into tenements, exploited in the airless sweatshops of the garment trade, but breathing nonetheless the air of freedom, the air of opportunity. They made new lives in the new land, not knowing as they worked toward a more prosperous future that they were working too toward a day when their support would help bring to fulfillment the vision of a youth still in Russia, the vision of Chaim Weizmann. Another road led toward Palestine, then under Turkish rule, but it was blocked by legalities and lack of opportunity. And there was a third road from the ghetto, the road which led to the universities of Western Europe, the road to enlightenment and education. This was the road that Weizmann chose, believing that education was essential to the fulfillment of his Zionist dream. He went first to Pfungstadt, an obscure little village in Germany. His name can still be seen in the register in Pfungstadt's town hall. Perhaps the cobblestones reminded him of Motl, but this was a very different village. In these streets, Weizmann first came face to face with a strange and unfamiliar world. Each day he left Pfungstadt to take the train for nearby Darmstadt. It It was in Darmstadt that he began his studies in chemistry. Studies he continued in the first great world metropolis he would know, Berlin. In 1896, while Weizmann was a student in Berlin, a little pamphlet was published in Leipzig and Vienna, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, which proposed as the solution of the Jewish problem the creation of a Jewish state. Its author, Theodor Herzl, whose words and actions would have a dramatic impact on the course of Jewish history and the vision of Chaim Weizmann. At the age of 23, Chaim Weizmann became Dr. Chaim Weizmann, receiving his degree magna cum laude at the University of Freiburg. Soon after, he took his first teaching job at the University of Geneva. In Geneva, he met Vera Hatzmann, a young medical student who would become his wife, standing at his side through the trials and triumphs of more than 50 years. In Russia, anti-Semitism, never far beneath the surface, exploded in the violence of the Kishinev pogrom of 1903. The massacre of the Jews of Kishinev gave new meaning to the movement of which Herzl had become the acknowledged leader. But only a year later, in 1904, at the age of 44, Theodor Herzl died. The prophet of the return to Zion was gone. In the same year, 1904, Weizmann emigrated to England, a country he had admired from his early boyhood. Something in the British tradition had inspired him always, and always would. He joined the Department of Chemistry at the University of Manchester. They were happy years. In Manchester, he made his first home with his young wife. Here, his first child, Benjamin, was born. And here he established the twofold pattern of his life. The life of a scientist who would never relinquish his interest in research, and the life of a leading Zionist who would never cease to work for the creation of a homeland for his people. In 1907, Weizmann visited Palestine for the first time. He looked at this ancient land with deep emotion, with love, but also with the eyes of a scientist. What he saw convinced him that a Jewish homeland could not be built by political agitation alone. He believed this land could become Jewish only if it were reclaimed by Jewish hands, the hands of Jewish pioneers. Some who were already there had come from the same Russian Jewish background as Weizmann, but had chosen to give up a formal education for physical labor in Palestine. Among them was David Ben-Gurion, the future Prime Minister of Israel. By 1914, although 85,000 Jews were living in Palestine, Jewish statehood was a still distant dream. But in August of that year, history quickened its pace. Jewish soldiers fought in all the armies of the world, many on the soil of Palestine. In Jerusalem, Jewish soldiers of the Austrian army prayed at the Wailing Wall, the holiest place of their religion. 100 miles away in the desert, Jewish soldiers of the British army prayed in the same language to the same God. In England, Weizmann made an important scientific contribution to the war effort. On special assignment from the British Admiralty, he invented a synthetic which kept British guns firing. It was no small contribution. In return for his services, Chaim Weizmann asked a grateful British government for support of his Zionist goals. The scientist became a diplomat. The man who grew up in the Russian ghetto was received by the most important statesman of his time. Working with Lord Balfour, England's Foreign Secretary, Weizmann achieved the long-sought legal basis for a Jewish Palestine, the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. While British troops under General Allenby marched into Jerusalem, Chaim Weizmann was named head of His Majesty's Palestine Commission. Its purpose, to further the spirit of the Balfour Declaration. The British had opened the legal way to a Jewish state. Now, in Palestine, it was Weizmann's task to keep it open. He met with Emir Faisal, later the first king of Iraq. His words were reassuring.
We Jews intend to live in peace with the Arabs. We do not intend to come to Palestine as conquerors, but as a people which returns to its ancient homeland.
He met with the Jewish settlers, planning with them what he saw as the next practical steps to be taken. At the war's end, the League of Nations gave Britain a mandate over Palestine, a trusteeship until a Jewish state could be established. Weizmann knew that colonization, practical work, and the funds to do it were now needed to bring the promise to reality. He traveled from country to country, from continent to continent, appealing for the material means to help the development of Palestine. The cities changed, the faces changed, but his message remained the same.
To get your money, we have to transform Palestine into a reality. To transform Palestine into a reality, we need your money.
The brilliant scientist, the persuasive statesman, became a fundraiser. In his almost frantic, always driving effort, he enlisted others, all whom he could convince. In 1921, he succeeded in recruiting the greatest scientist of his time, Albert Einstein, who had just received the Nobel Prize. Together they traveled with their wives to the United States. Einstein, who shared Weizmann's hopes for a Jewish homeland, was particularly sympathetic to Weizmann's dream of a Hebrew university. In 1925, the dream ceased to be a dream. On a hill overlooking Jerusalem, the Hebrew University was opened. Lord Balfour, who had already achieved a lasting place in Jewish history, delivered the major address. Distinguished guests from every continent listened. The chief rabbis of Palestine listened. Members of the British administration listened. And Chaim Weizmann listened. The building of an academic foundation for a free Jewish state had been started. But the land itself had also to be built. With funds Chaim Weizmann had helped to raise, more and more young pioneers began the reclamation of the soil.
Without exaggeration, our pioneers in Palestine would be the pride of any people. They are our miracle. Maybe it's the collected idealism of generations which erupts in Palestine and becomes a force and a fact.
Germany, 1933. The flames of burning books. A different force. A different fact. Jews had contributed brilliantly to German cultural life, now threatened by the growing Nazi movement. Jews not wanted. As the Nazi tide rose, the Jews of Central Europe fled to Palestine in great numbers. Many were intellectuals, scholars, doctors, scientists. Some found work at the Hebrew University and other educational institutions. But many had to make a sharp and difficult adjustment. Somehow they adapted themselves to a new and different life. As the influx of immigrants swelled, the Arabs reacted with hostility. By 1936, the Jewish community was faced not only with the physical hardships of a pioneering land, but also with a mounting Arab threat to life. Some of the settlers were killed in Arab ambushes. The entire Jewish community mourned. In defense, the Jews armed themselves. Chaim Weizmann interpreted the drama of self-defense.
There is hardly a parallel in human history to these people who work the soil with one hand and carry a weapon in the other, who build and stand guard at the same time.
To investigate the disorders, the British government appointed a royal commission headed by Lord Peel. They looked strangely formal in a land racked by violence as they marked Armistice Day, the Armistice Day of the First World War. At the commission's hearings, Weizmann stated the case for his people with eloquence and dignity. His words echoed in the hearing chamber even as he left it.
The problem of the Jews is the problem of the homelessness of a people.
The Royal Commission report suggested the partitioning of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. But in Zurich, at the Zionist Congress of 1937, the 20th meeting of the World Zionist Movement, almost all delegates were against partition, but not Weizmann. Palestine's Arabs opposed partition too. Under the leadership of the Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, they pressed for a new British policy. To appease the Arabs, the British published a white paper which restricted Jewish immigration and prohibited the sale of land to Jews in Palestine. An outraged Jewish community reacted bitterly against the British desertion of the Balfour Declaration. In August of 1939, the World Zionist Congress met in Geneva under the shadow of the White Paper, which threatened the destruction of the Jewish dream of a national home, and under the shadow of a war which threatened the destruction of all human liberties. On August 22nd, the Zionist leaders learned of the fateful Nazi-Soviet pact. These men, without a state, were statesmen. They understood the meaning of the pact. Within a week, Hitler's army invaded Poland. In Palestine, Jewish youth volunteered for the British Army. As millions of European Jews were annihilated by the Hitler terror, Chaim Weizmann appealed in vain to the Allies to save those who could still be saved. He watched helplessly as the tragedy deepened. And then, into his own life, there came the tragedy of war. Michael, his younger son, flying for the Royal Air Force, was killed. It was only after the defeat of Nazi Germany that the full dimensions of the destruction of European Jewry became known. Those who had survived began an irresistible migration toward the haven of the Promised Land. Shipload by shipload, the so-called illegal immigrants came, steaming into Haifa Bay. But the British still refused to allow them to enter. Those who had survived the concentration camps found that they were still not free to live as free human beings. terrorists began a bitter fight against the British administration. The British tried to enforce a curfew in the cities. They searched houses and settlements for hidden terrorists and hidden arms. They covered the approaches to British government buildings with barbed wire. Yet no barbed wire could contain the Jewish will for independence. In 1947, admitting defeat, the British government referred the Palestine problem to the United Nations. As so often before, it was Chaim Weizmann who expressed the innermost feelings of the Jewish people. He denounced terrorist activity.
"Thou shalt not kill" has been ingrained in us since Mount Sinai. But the urgency of a solution can no longer be put aside.
On November 29, 1947, the solution was reached by vote of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Palestine was to be partitioned into Jewish and Arab states. 5 months later, on May 14, 1948, in Tel Aviv, a provisional government under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel. The Declaration of Independence of the Jewish state was signed, but not by Chaim Weizmann. He was still in America. At Weizmann's urgent plea, President Truman recognized the State of Israel within hours. Only a few days later, Chaim Weizmann, who had been named President of Israel, performed his first official act. He expressed his country's gratitude to President Truman for the immediate recognition of Israel in a deeply symbolic gift, a Torah, the scrolls of the Jewish law, the law which throughout the ages has been a foundation for man's quest for freedom, social justice, and peace. Peace in Israel had still to be fought for. 5 invading Arab armies tried to destroy by force what Israel had been granted by the vote of the nations of the world. The young state succeeded in defending its newly won independence and opened its gates to an unprecedented tide of immigration. From every corner of the globe they came, the persecuted and oppressed, the old and young, differing in background, diverse in culture, yet sharing a common goal, a life of freedom and human dignity. This was the moment of fulfillment of the vision of Chaim Weizmann, who on February 2nd, 1949, took the oath of office as President of Israel. He had become the symbol of a nation's revival, the only nation to be reborn in all the world's history after an exile of 2,000 years. Yet only 4 years later, a nation plunged into mourning would bear Chaim Weizmann to his final resting place. The man they mourned had done what no Jew throughout the ages had done. He had had a vision and a dream. He had worked toward that vision and fulfilled it. Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, lies beneath the soil to which he led his people. Silently, beneath the soil. Silently. Yet for all who seek or cherish freedom, his voice is vibrantly alive.
We must build up a great tradition of learning. We must create schools and cultivate science. Israel must be a moral, social, intellectual force which will make its contribution to the pool of knowledge for the benefit of all mankind. This is our message of hope sent forth from this sacred place to all throughout the world, to all who struggle for freedom and equality. There is hope at the end for all who long for justice.
This was the vision of Chaim Weizmann.